Some people are starting to come in. Hello, everyone. It's a good afternoon for us in Geneva, but my greetings for wherever you may be joining us today. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research and the University for Peace to this open webinar on careers in international law and diplomacy. Allow me to just share my screen. All right, kindly allow me to introduce myself as your moderator. My name is Shayna Mayers. I work with the International Law Program at UNITAR's Division for Multilateral Diplomacy. I'm delighted to be joined here today by our esteemed experts in international law and more, Dr. Mihir Kanade and Dr. Elodie Tranchet. Dr. Mihir Kanade is a professor of international law, human rights, and development at UPEACE. He is their academic coordinator and head of the Department of International Law and director of the UPEACE Human Rights Center. He is also known for his contribution to the promotion of human right to development, being recently elected by the UN Human Rights Council as a member of the expert mechanism on the right to development. Also joining us today is Dr. Elodie Tranchet, who is a French international law and human rights expert and author of various publications and a very valued collaborator here at UNITAR for many of our international law courses. So soon our experts will begin the presentations, after which you will have the opportunity to ask them your questions during a quick Q&A session. During the presentation, you may kindly use the Q&A function on your screen to write us your questions, and we will do our best to make sure that we read out as many as possible towards the end. But before we jump into that, this webinar is part of a larger series called the Make an Impact webinar series, a collection of free online events presented jointly by UNITAR and UPEACE. Each session will feature experts in their respective fields discussing some of the most pressing aspects of law, diplomacy, and the UN's work to advance the SDGs. So I invite you to check out those and stay tuned for the upcoming sessions in this very exciting series. UNITAR and UPEACE will also be running a master in international law and diplomacy. So we kindly ask all interested applicants to visit the UPEACE website or scan the QR code to find out more about the application process. These are the application deadlines and start dates, and the program will be offered either on-site, online, or in hybrid modalities. We would also be delighted to welcome you to our new Master in International Law and the Settlement of Disputes. Again, please take note of the deadlines here. Visit the UPEACE website or scan the QR code. Information on these programs are also readily available on the UNITAR website, or we invite you to ask your questions at admissions@upeace.org or info.ilp@unitar.org. And this year, I'm very excited to announce that we will also be able to offer the Pura Vida Fellowship for potential participants from the LDCs and small island developing states. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm pleased to give the floor to our first speaker, Elodie.
Thank you, Shaina. I will just share my screen right now. It is a pleasure to be with you, UNITAR and UPEACE. I'm going to exchange a bit on the way to have a career in international law and diplomacy. So definitely a few words of introduction. As you've been mentioning, my name is Elodie Tranchet. I'm French. I hold a PhD in international law from the University of Aix-en-Provence. I joined Geneva 10 years ago. I occupied various functions with civil society, with the UN. Now I'm back to civil society, and that's something I'm going to discuss with you, that having a career in international law, it's made of bridges and how you jump from one sector to another sector. And just for you to know, like, yes, there is no limitation when we talk about international and diplomacy. The potentialities, the opportunities are quite broad, actually. And what is important at some point is just to step in. That's the first thing you need to know. Step in. Either it is with civil society, either it's with government, either it's with an international organization. Once you are in the system, that's it. And something I really want to share with you is this idea that, okay, you're here in this webinar today, so definitely you are someone who's trying to have a bit of planification, but Yeah, sure. It's important to have a strategy. It's important to know where you want to go. So definitely have a direction, but forget about having a detailed roadmap. Of course, it depends if you're 20 or if you're 40. Maybe give you slightly different advices, but just for you to know, when I was 20 years ago starting the PhD, I was dreaming of having a career at the ICJ. I was just dreaming about international law and, what I had in mind, like true international law. I just had contempt towards human rights, to be honest. And then today, I'm the most passionate person ever about advocating and advancing human rights. Just for you to know, if you just come with such a detailed roadmap, you might miss opportunities that life is offering you. And that's a reality, that when you are in international career, you may have a lot of opportunities. And so have a direction, but don't have a narrow mind about what you really, really want to achieve. But definitely, you need a direction. And first direction is that you need an education. And I'd say that if you don't have at least a master in international law, well, you won't manage in having an international career. It might appear obvious, but yet it's important for me to share. So definitely check at the programs that are offered to you. That's a reality. And then, I mean, international is quite broad. Then you might actually identify what interests you most. It can be trade, it can be environment, it can be specific group like women, children, specific phenomenon. It's really up to you. But first of all, start really by having an education in international law. And yes, depending also how old you are, having an international career, it's quite fascinating, but it may require a bit of patience. So if you're 20 years old, it's very different if you're 35 or 40 years old with already a career, with a family, with children. If you're 20 years old, I'd say definitely go for it, go on the field, have a lot of experiences, but it might be different if you have responsibilities, if you have a family. So it's very important for you to keep that also as a background. I mean, you may have the international dream of having a career, but that's also a reality that it requires, most of the time, it would require a bit of patience. We're going to focus a lot on actually getting in an international career through the UN. And yes, getting a position with the UN, it happens. To be honest, it happens. I was selected in the UN and I knew no one in the UN. That's one of the beliefs, this legend that you cannot get in the UN if you are not connected to someone. Yes, you can. I've been here, but it takes time, definitely. And also identify your skills, your desires. I mean, having an international career, it might be very different, having in mind the United Nations, you can be with the communication section, you can be with the finance section, you can be with human rights section. It is so broad. Actually, having an international career, it's actually a reflect of having somehow domestic career. So get that also in mind, see what you'd like to have. I mean, it depends. If you are very oriented towards even academic work, you might say, oh, I want to work for the Secretariat of the International Commission. If you're more oriented towards meeting people and civil society, you might be, oh, I want to be with the Secretariat and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights section on actually creating and coordinating with civil society. So it's really up to you. And just keep that in mind. Having an international career, it's not only being a diplomat or being a staff serving bodies of the United Nations. It might be very, very broad. But definitely, I'd say that starting with the United Nations, it is always a good idea if you want to get an international career, because, I mean, compared to notably diplomatic career, most of the time, diplomatic career, you need to get some domestic requirements. So you need to pass exam to have a specific path most of the time, depending on which country you're coming from, but it might be a long path. When it comes to the United Nations, you have your master, you have a bit of experience, and that's it. You apply and you might end up with having a position. And definitely why United Nations are such a good idea. Look at this organigram of the United Nations, such a complex organization because the purpose of the United Nations is so complex. I always make fun of the United Nations saying that the only thing that is missing is the right to happiness because it's so huge. Maintaining international peace, and look at Article 1, Paragraph 3 of the UN, achieving international cooperation in solving international problems of economic, social, cultural, humanitarian character. Oof, it is so broad. So look at all these agencies, funds, programs that are actually depending from the UN system. It is quite huge. So depending what is your interest, you will find something. Look, for instance, just at the specialized agencies. You have the FAO, it's Food and Agriculture. ICAO, it's International Civil Aviation Organization. ILO, Labor Organization. You have the World Bank group. It is broad, definitely. So find what you like and then jump on that. So getting an entry door to the United Nations, that's the big question. And definitely, again, it depends about your age. So if you start as a junior, you are very beginning of your career, it is very good first to start with an internship. Big problem with the internship in the United Nations is that most of the time it is not paid. And most of the time it's happening in cities that are super expensive, like New York or Geneva. But in any case, it would give you first-hand experience with what it means to be in the Secretariat of the United Nations. And also it would give you the networks that you would actually need to actually advance in your career. I've known many of my colleagues in the United Nations that started as an intern in the UN. And the possibilities, if you're above 25, is actually to be a UNV, a UN volunteer. It's also, I'd say, most of the time for beginning of career, but at least in this time it is paid, and most of the time you'd get first-hand experience on the field. Most of the time with a peacekeeping operation would be very decisive for you. Also check at the GPO. GPO are those program junior professional officers. They are funded by National Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the idea is to fund a junior professional in the system. So it would be France, Denmark, Italy, USA, Korea, Japan, India, well, whatever country, financing for like 5 or 6 candidates per year. Depending on the needs, you could be deployed to New York, you could be deployed to Nairobi. Most of the time, you need to get a bit of experience before. So you cannot directly finish your master program and say, oh, I want to be a GPO. Most of the time, you need to get like 2 or 3 years of experience, and then you can apply to GPO. But that's a very good way to start with an international career. And check also if your country is not actually financing GPOs. Some countries are actually financing GPOs for non-citizens. I think that Denmark is doing so, Italy is doing so. So it's quite an interesting opening for the UN. Another one is definitely the YPP. It's the Young Professional Program. So you may know about it. It's an exam that is happening once per year. And it depending on the subject needed from the UN, it can be political affairs, humanitarian affairs, human rights affairs, legal affairs. It's the difficulty that you have, especially if you're coming from the WEO group, from the Western group, is that you have nationality restrictions. So it is open to certain nationality only some years. I think, for instance, for the USA, there have not been any YPP since a few years, I think. But some nationalities are really, really in need. So check it. Most of the time, you could apply for it by the beginning of summer, most of the time. And it doesn't mean that if you pass the exam of the YPP, that you are in the system. But that it means that you are qualified, and it will really make your life easier to actually apply and get a position in the United Nations. So that's it if you're a junior. But if you're not a junior, if you're over 32, what can you do? Well, first of all, you can have a look at the vacancies that exist in the United Nations. And careers.un.org, it's a good website to have a look at it. Definitely, that's key. There is something you must know. It's called Inspira, the human resource portal of the United Nations. What is nice is that once you've built what we call the PHP, your personal history profile, you can reuse it for all positions. You just have to tailor it depending on what position you're applying, but it's done. So I'd say when you are creating your history profile, be very detailed, be very specific, and do not hesitate to use the UN wording, you know. They have a specific jargon, you know, they speak with specific terminology, so use it really. Get inspired by it. Also, definitely the cover letter is quite important. Make it to the point, not too long, and also use the wording of the United Nations. And keep something in mind. The United Nations are not today in the best financial situation, so we have like less and less permanent positions. So you would have like the permanent positions and the temporary position. Keep in mind that it's always easier to get in the temporary position. So keep that in mind. Also keep that in mind that you are many applicants. So you don't apply for one position and say, hey, I've done my job. I apply for one position to the United Nations. You have to fill sometimes 10, 15, 20, 25 positions for the United Nations before getting an invitation for an exam. And definitely what is key is patience. The recruitment process may take months, if not years. In my case, I recently had a CBI, which is a competence-based interview for a position I applied to 2 years ago. So it's a bit amazing sometimes how the UN can be slow. But yeah, it's something you have to keep in mind to stay positive, to be patient, and to be persistent. And definitely what you should have in mind is that having an international career, it's actually creating bridges. I told you about my personal history. I came from civil society. Then I jumped to international organizations. I'm back to civil society. I'm also in the academic teaching. I have many colleagues who are actually also working with permanent missions now. You know, working as a diplomat most of the time, as I told you, it requires having the old domestic path and exam and all that. But many permanent mission in Geneva or in New York, they have those specific contracts for the locals. So especially the UK permanent mission, for instance, they would actually hire for special contract staff that are based in Geneva. So I had former colleagues from the United Nations who were with civil society, and now they're working for Belgium or for the USA. Also, same, there are some states who are actually in need of qualified staff. And although you're not a national from this permanent mission, you might be working them depending on your expertise. So that's definitely something you have to keep in mind. There is a lot of fluidity between the three sectors, definitely international, it's government, civil society, and international organization. But think about the system and not having walls between those areas. You can jump from one sector to the other one. And that's it. What I can tell you is that if you have a bit of determination, anyone can have a fulfilling international career. It just requires a bit of patience. That's it from my side. I wanted to make it short and concise.
All right, thank you so much, Elodie, for that very interesting presentation. I will now give the floor to Dr. Mihir. Dr. Mihir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Shaina, and thank you, Elodie, for that wonderful overview of the career opportunities within the United Nations. And this is, in fact, an integral part of the two master's programs that Shaina pointed out at the beginning. We do run a career workshop as part of that program, where students are trained on, building a career within the United Nations systems or international law in general. Now, I'll basically complement, a lot of the points that Elodie has already pointed out. But I'll also try to bring in my own personal and professional experiences in a lot of these aspects. As was introduced, I am the academic coordinator of the University for Peace and the head of the Department of International Law. And in that capacity, I actually coordinate both these master's programs that we jointly offer with UNITAR. But another role that I play, as was also introduced at the beginning, is I'm a mandate holder of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, which elected me as an expert on the something called the expert mechanism on the right to development. And part of my role was to chair the drafting of a new international human rights treaty, which is called the International Covenant on the Right to Development. And I learned a lot during that process because I was literally leading the negotiation process among states and civil society actors on the draft of that treaty, and it took about 3 to 4 years for a final draft to be agreed upon at the Human Rights Council, and it has now been forwarded to the General Assembly in New York for final adoption. So a lot of what I will say is based on that experience. Now, what I've learned is that there are certainly a lot of areas in peace and security, human rights, sustainable development, climate change, which we often refer to as common concerns of humankind. And these definitely need common solutions that are agreed upon through multilateralism. And clearly, diplomacy is the key to multilateralism. And diplomacy comes in at all stages of multilateralism, which is closely connected with international law. So it's relevant to international lawmaking, it's relevant to the implementation of international law, and it's relevant to enforcement of international law as well. Now, one thing that's very interesting because of this wide-ranging feature of diplomacy and international law in general is that you actually do not need to have an LLB, a Bachelor of Laws, to study international law. And this comes from the fact that international law straddles across many different areas of global governance. Diplomacy straddles across many different areas of international or global governance, and therefore you don't actually need to have an LLB to study international law. There are multiple number of diplomats that I've encountered in my work who are specialists in a particular area, but need not necessarily be lawyers. But what they're actually participating in is international lawmaking, right? And this is because international lawmaking or international law in general is fundamentally different from domestic law because international law operates in the absence of a world government. At the domestic level, we have a vertical top-down structure where parliaments make the law and they are binding on all subjects within the state's jurisdiction. At the international level, however, the structure is more horizontal. That is, each country is a sovereign equal, at least in the on paper and in the formal sense. There is no world parliament. The General Assembly of the United Nations is not a world parliament. The Secretary General is not the world's president, right? So for international law to be binding on any state, it must consent to be bound by it, mostly through ratification these days. But before that stage also, you have the stage of adoption of the text of a treaty itself. And this entails a lot of negotiation, mediation, multilateralism, and diplomacy. Even at the stage of implementation of international law, very often we know that states do not implement the obligations that they may have undertaken under international law. So diplomacy, and I would say not just multilateral, but also sometimes bilateral, has historically been the primary means of securing implementation. And multilateralism in general is a very effective tool for implementation of the obligations by states. Now, I talked about the stages of lawmaking and implementation, but think about enforcement as well, right? When enforcement of obligations is to be is a criteria, is a factor, even then we have seen that multilateralism tends to work best. Now, in terms of moving towards and kind of dovetailing this towards the aspect of careers in international law, a point that I think is very important to understand is that the practice of international law is very wide-ranging, as Elodie alluded to. It is much more exhaustive than legal practice at the domestic level. When domestic lawyers or lawyers within a particular municipal regime think of international legal practice, it is often assumed that this is about arguing cases before regional or international courts or tribunals. But the fact of the matter is that is hardly 5% of international legal practice. And just to put this in a more theoretical lens, there is one Article 33 of the Charter of the United Nations, which tells us the different ways in which countries are expected to settle their disputes. And it basically says that the parties to any dispute, the continuance of which is likely to endanger the maintenance of international peace and security, shall first of all seek solution by negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, resort to regional agencies or arrangements, or other peaceful means of their own choice, right? What this means is that international lawyers, whether in the field of diplomacy or in the field of settlement of disputes more specifically, are not limited to practicing before courts. That is very small percentage of the areas in which international lawyers can work and do work, right? So careers in international law for international lawyers, whether in diplomacy or settlement of disputes, are very wide-ranging. Elodie focused on United Nations, but she also pointed out that she made a switch to civil society, and she gave her experiences on those. So international lawyers, of course, work in United Nations system, in intergovernmental organizations, but also with non-governmental organizations, with governments, with their own governments, as, let's say, foreign service officers, or representing their governments as diplomats in negotiations abroad, or at the United Nations or the World Trade Organization, etc. And also international lawyers like myself find a lot of avenues in the field of academia as well. But that's not it. International lawyers are increasingly being sought in the areas of business, in the private sector. Because increasingly the private sector, I'm not talking here only about commercial law as such, right? It's not only about private international law or trade law or investment law, but even in the field of, let's say, business and human rights. A lot of corporations are increasingly required to, by their own governments, by their own regions, to conduct human rights due diligence, human rights impact assessments of the activities of the corporations. And you need for that international lawyers who are trained in that field, right? So the point I'm making is that international lawyers work today in a wide network of different actors. You can't compartmentalize international lawyer in the UN and say that's my exclusive zone, because you will need to interact with international lawyers from working with the NGOs or in academia or even in businesses or with other governments. Now, in international relations theory, this new trend is actually called network diplomacy, which is in contrast to what previously was called as club diplomacy, which was the traditional state-centric diplomacy that carried on for a number of years, including in theory. Network diplomacy can generally be defined as a non-hierarchical type of interaction between nations and nation-state actors, but also non-state actors, including in negotiation, power techniques, soft power techniques in particular, with the aim of addressing global problems. Now, I can tell you from my own personal experience that when the negotiation on the International Covenant on the Right to Development took place, the contributions came not only from states, but also from civil society organizations who were very much invested in negotiating every single term of the treaty, right? They would comment on every single thing. They provided extensive remarks. So we had the United Nations system, we had international organizations commenting on the text. The IOM, the International Organization of Migration, wanted some modifications. The UNESCO wanted some modifications, but we had a lot of these NGOs, pushing the states to deal with some of these languages. For example, there was a pushback from some states against the use of the word gender in the treaty. And the civil society would have none of it. They fought for it. And in the end, the final text did have the word gender in it, right? And these are the areas and scopes of work where international lawyers contribute to in a multifarious ways. Now, finally, I would just say that as humanity faces these common concerns that I pointed out previously, the need and demand for international lawyers will only grow. It is an ever relevant profession, and my sense is that it is only going to be more and more important in the future. It's not like one of those professions which will fade away with the rise of artificial intelligence, for instance, right? You do need human beings who are actual diplomats, who understand the emotions, who can come to negotiated outcomes, who can convince judges about a particular point passionately. So it is something that is relevant. The opportunities in this field are endless. Literally, sky is the ceiling, I would say. There are no limitations in the areas that you can work in. And of course, in terms of these two programs that UPEACE and UNITAR offer together, I'm personally very proud of it, having been at the helm of the two programs since its very conceptualization. But I can also tell you from experience that the brand value of the programs is tremendous, because UPEACE and UNITAR are the two leading institutions that are part of the academic wing of the United Nations. UPEACE is the degree granting institution. UNITAR is the specialized institution on training within the UN system. So I would say that the UN is an equal opportunity employer. However, you can imagine that when a CV comes in front of them, which has a degree from UPEACE and UNITAR, even if it's subconsciously, students do tend to get an easier entry into, or easier foot in the door. And this applies not just for jobs, but also for internships or positions at the United Nations Volunteers Program or others. And governments tend to value it a lot because, UPEACE is an intergovernmental body. All countries unanimously support the university, support UNITAR. So there's a lot of buy-in from governments as well. In fact, a lot of our students, I was talking to Elodie before this presentation, a lot of our current students are actually those that are working with governments or with the United Nations system, in addition to those that are joining the program afresh because they want to specialize in international law or diplomacy and want to join those professions. So the brand value matters a lot. And I think I can stop there, Shaina, and let's open up the floor for questions. And we'll be very happy to take those and answer as well as we can.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mihir, for your insights. I do hope all of you got some value, inspiration, ideas, and just general hope from that very important presentation. We will now start our Q&A session, and I see we already have some questions for our panelists, but do feel free to write your questions in the Q&A box below. So allow me to read out one now. We have one from Arslan Beg, and he asks, would you say it is a really bad time to romanticize a career in the UN Secretariat for young professionals due to budget cuts, hiring freezes, etc.?
Well,
go ahead, Lily, first.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for raising. It's true that the UN are in a bad position right now, but as we say, there is nothing new under the sun. I mean, international organizations have always been facing a lot of backlashes. I was reading recently a biography from the first Secretary General of the League of Nations, and he was already experiencing also those difficulties regarding budget and freezing and cut in the budget. So that's a reality that you don't start a UN career in 2024 as you started a UN career 30 years ago. Beginning of 90s, the world was opening, end of its history. It's a different career, that's true. But I fully agree with you, Mihir, that definitely we will need international lawyers, we need international civil servants, that's for sure. So yes, take that into consideration. You may have to be more attentive to your career, and somehow maybe it's even good. I've been in the system for a while in the United Nations, and I've seen what bureaucracy can do to people. So maybe it's good also that people have to actually fight somehow also for their jobs. So yes, it's good to be aware of the situation. There are budget cuts. We are all looking very much at what is happening with the 2024 election in the USA. USA being the first contributor. We feel it when the USA are not paying their contribution. This is what we're facing now is already what it's already a result of the USA, but don't be demotivated because of budget issues. I do believe that the UN will be around for quite a while. I am a fervent believer in the UN. Although I criticize the UN, I'm a fervent believer in the UN. I believe we have a better world because of the United Nations, that's for sure.
Thanks, Elodie, for that. I'll just add that the United Nations system works on regular budgets, which come from the assessed contributions that states are required to pay, and in that, United States is capped at 22%, and right now China is contributing 16%. So that just these two countries are contributing substantially, right? About 38% of the United Nations budget. And I'm talking here about regular budget. But a lot of the United Nations work also comes from extra budgetary contributions, which are basically voluntary contributions that countries make to specific institutions or for specific projects. Now we have this liquidity crisis in the United Nations because both US and China delayed by substantial time the contributions that they were required to make to the United Nations. And when two major contributors amounting to together to about 38% of the United Nations budget don't do that, then the system kind of feels crippled. So it's a fact that there are certain freezes right now on new jobs at the United Nations system. But as Elodie pointed out, this is not something new. It fluctuates, it varies at different times of the year. There are always openings within the United Nations system. So do check out careers.un.org that Elodie pointed out, and do check out Inspira. You're going to find positions there. Whether these are funded from the regular budget or these are funded from extra budgetary contributions of states, there are always these openings. I would, however, also add here that getting a job with the United Nations requires you to consider many different factors. It's not just about whether there are openings and whether you're qualified on paper. There are considerations of regional representation, which are very important. Nationality quotas, at least at the entry level of the United Nations system, there are nationality quotas which are proportionate to the amount of contribution your country makes to the United Nations system. These don't matter at the higher levels, but at the entry levels, these do matter. And for many students, gender is an important consideration. But I would also say that for many students, what they tend to forget is that if you want to get an international job at the United Nations, it is quite important to at least be, to be perfect with one UN language, but also have at least some working knowledge of another UN language. And this is where a lot of students, let's say from South Asia, where I come from, actually do not make it at the entry levels, P1, P2, P3 levels in the UN, because they don't tend to speak another UN language other than English. So it's very important that if that's your ambition, that you invest your time in learning another UN language. It could be French, it could be Spanish, Arabic, Russian, Mandarin, what have you. But it is important that you invest your time in learning another UN language, because you can imagine that when the evaluators get two equally qualified candidates on the paper, they are likely to choose the candidate who speaks two UN languages than one, because it makes life much more easier in the office for them, right? So these are just some of those things that you need to pay particular attention to in terms of working with the UN.
All right, thank you both. We have a question that builds off right where Dr. Mahir left off, and that's about the skills that one might need to enter the UN system. And that's another follow-up question from Arslan Beg, and he asks, how important is it to pass the bar in any jurisdiction, as it is a requirement advantage for a good chunk for advertised positions?
No, well, to be honest, it depends, but it's not necessarily such a requirement. It depends. If you want to become an arbitration lawyer, definitely you need to pass an exam. But for most of the UN position, you don't need to get any bar exam, I'd say, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it might be important to have an international law degree, but you don't necessarily need to have a bar exam and qualify or be certified as a practicing lawyer before your domestic jurisdiction. It's quite immaterial, in fact, and I would say in the field of international law. It might, the only areas where I think it might be something that is relevant is, arbitration lawyers, or let's say the Office of Legal Affairs of the United Nations Headquarters Secretariat in New York, maybe there, but in general, you don't need to have that. As long as you specialize in international law, it's already quite enough.
Amazing, thank you. Another question quite similar to the last is from Rasha Hamadi. Is it possible to become an international lawyer by title or working in courts, etc., with this master's degree that is part of the joint UNITAR UPEACE master's program without a former background in law?
Yes, it is. It is. Although strange that it might sound, it actually is. We have had instances of students who did not have an LLB or a bachelor degree in law. They completed this, an international law program at UPEACE, and did an internship at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and were later hired just on the basis of the international law degree. We have other instances where students without an LLB are actually working with the International Court of Human Rights in the Americas, which is the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. They are working there both with the court and with organizations that represent clients before courts. So it is entirely possible to do that. Of course, contexts matter. There might be some courts, there might be some law firms who would insist that you require a bachelor degree in law, but there is nothing that disqualifies you from practicing as an international lawyer before courts or working in courts if you do not have a domestic law degree.
Elodie, I see you shaking your head. Do you want to add to that? No? All right, let me look for another question. And this is a very important one, and we have the same question from two people, and that is, many UN organizations pledge to become inclusive. Is there any simplified process for people with disabilities to get a job in the UN?
That's a good question. I'm not exactly familiar about how the UN, especially in the recruitment process, actually operates. So I will need to actually check on that. I had myself many colleagues with disability. So I assume that when taking the written exam, the CBI, all that, there must have been some kind of accommodation. But to be perfectly honest, I'm not 100% on that topic. Maybe you know more.
Well, I do know that they do make accommodations. They're required to for being more inclusive in terms of applicants who are persons with disabilities. But I again, like you, I don't know the finer details of the applications process, what needs to be given, what documentation needs to be given to be able to be offered accommodations in certain things. So I'm not aware of those finer details. However, I can definitely say that if informed, they would give a lot of accommodation, let's say in interviews or things like that, right? Yeah, but unfortunately, that's the extent to which my knowledge of this particular question goes.
All right, thank you so much for your treatment of the question. I know it's a bit of a difficult one, but yeah, we can say that the UN does make accommodations for people with disabilities. So I hope that has answered your question, at least. Another question we have here, and this is a very important one for prospective applicants. We have from Fatima, and she's a magistrate in Nigeria and would like to transition into the international law field, especially in the UN. She's submitted several applications to the UN, but has never really been shortlisted for an interview. Is there anything that can be done that will stand her out amidst the thousands of applicants?
Well, I mean, Mihir also mentioned some elements. Language is one of the most important skills that would make you a candidate maybe more visible. That's probably what made me in the system, like this ability to draft in French, Spanish, and English. That let's be honest on that. I mean, also it depends. I mean, since you're already a magistrate, it depends also on which kind of position you're applying. Definitely, if you're applying for a P2, P3, P4 position, you're by yourself. But if you are a high-level magistrate from Nigeria, and if you have a bit of connection also with your government, you know, it's something also to be explored. Government might be happy to get someone on board in the UN system with a D1 position or even a P5 position. So it is a practice. I'm not saying that it's the best practice ever, but that's a reality. That, you know, I talk about international organization as with a Frankenstein metaphor, you know, it's a creature and state that like to have a bit of control from inside, and having national citizens in those big positions, it can be useful. Otherwise, that's a reality. And it's something that I told you, I mean, trying to get a UN position, it is a bit draining. And sometimes you feel like you're sending a bottle to the sea and you don't even know if your message is actually giving any results. That's a reality.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that, but I'll just say that, it really also depends on what type of position you are applying to. Because, for any UN position, what they would be looking for is your entry profile. What is your academic background? What is your professional background? And how does that combine with the job that is being offered, right? So there has to be some sort of a direct link between that. Um, what type of position you are applying to, which organization you are applying to, because the UN system is very big, as the chart that Elodie pointed out noted, right? I mean, you have those various offices that work under the Secretariat of the United Nations, but you also have specialized agencies which are completely independent in a lot of sense, which have their own funding structure, like let's say the UNESCO or the World Health Organization. They're part of the UN system, but their functioning is completely different, and they would also have legal positions, right? And then you have the programs, the funds, and the all the other institutes like UNITAR, or related organizations like International Organization of Migration, etc. So each one will have their different outlooks of what they want to see in an applicant based on the job profile. So the closer you are to your work experience, to the requirements of the job, the higher the likelihood of you getting that, being shortlisted for the interview. Therefore, it's very important that whenever you look for a position, that it's not just a legal position, right? What's really important is for you to look at the responsibilities. And in the UN, whenever there is a call for applications, they're all clearly articulated. What are the responsibilities? What are the competencies required? And what are the skills required? And in your application, it is extremely important that you articulate your case that shows how your work experience and your academic experience aligns with the required skills, competencies, and responsibilities. And it's actually this does require some sort of a training in that sense. And I know all of this because we do run a specialist, the deputy director of UNITAR, in fact, trains our students personally on building careers in the United Nations. And these are the kinds of things that they are taught: how to draft an application, how to search for the ideal position, how to give an interview, how to crack an interview. So it's an acquired art, it's an acquired skill. But these are the more or less, I would say, the most important areas which need to be spotlighted for you to get a sense of the things that go into being shortlisted for these interviews.
All right, thank you so much. We have another question. We have so many questions today. This one is a great one for career changers. We have one from Diana, coming from the private sector and currently a postgraduate diploma student in international law. Would it be appropriate for her to apply on P3 or P4 openings with the UN, considering that she has about 15 years international experience in the private sector? Or should she go first through some of the master's programs offered by UPEACE?
Mihai, you want to take it, maybe?
Sure. Look, I mean, I'll be honest with you that not doing the MA offered by UPEACE or some other university is not going to disqualify you from applying or from getting these positions if you are, the best candidate in the competition. The way I would suggest you approach this topic is slightly different. Now, for any position in the United Nations, you're going to have um, thousands of applicants for those positions, and most of them would be qualified in terms of the minimum requirements for the position. And let's say a P2 position may require 5 years, sometimes 7 years of work experience, but the actual applicants are going to be those who have 15 years of work experience many times, who speak multiple languages, who have a good amount of academic professional background. So the key question really is, how do you stand out in that crowd to be able to be shortlisted, get to the interview stage, and then of course or sometimes an exam also, and then go to the next stage, right? So you have to think about what are your strong areas that make you stand out, but also identify the things that you don't actually have, right? That are missing in your profile. And then you need to plug in those gaps to be able to build your CV in a manner that allows you to be even shortlisted. Because most of the candidates, I'd say 95% of the candidates, don't even make it to the shortlist because the 5% are so strong that they tend to lose out, right? So if you think that that what you're missing is a master's degree, both in terms of the academic profile, but also in terms of the knowledge that you may have in the field of international law, then I would definitely recommend that I would definitely say that it's a gap that you need to fill. It doesn't have to be UPEACE or UNITAR, but I mean, of course, UPEACE and UNITAR programs have their own added value in terms of the brand and the reception from the UN system and governments even, but it doesn't have to be. But the way I would encourage you to think is identify your gaps and try to fill them up so that you can reach the stage where you're competing with the 5%, not the remaining 95%. Elodie, maybe you can add.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of questions about the UN and how competitive it is. So maybe to give you a bit of tips, be always careful when you're applying for position. If you see, especially if it's secretariat, as Mia mentioned, I mean, there is secretariat position and specialized agencies, they may have different rules. But when it's secretariat position, if it's coming with air position, it means regular budget, it means it's a permanent contract. Be certain that we'll get 1 million people applying, including internal candidates and people who've been in the house for years. I had colleagues who had to wait 10 years before having a permanent contract. So take that in mind, take that into consideration. If you're applying for a permanent position in Geneva and New York, imagine that there is tons of internal candidates in Geneva, but also in the field. So that's something you must have in consideration. That's why if really you want to get in the system, start applying to temporary job opening. It's TGOs. It's always a good way to start. And as I told you, the best strategy is to step in. And also, there is a lot of competition, but definitely everyone wants to be in New York, in Geneva, in Vienna, in Nairobi, those big, big cities. And something I did not mention, because I mean, we could talk for 2 hours about just having a career in the UN, it's this roster stuff. So what I would advise you is that instead maybe of spending a lot of energy in building the best application for a permanent position in New York that you would be competing with 1,000 people, maybe find this position that where you're really qualified in Juba, in South Sudan, for instance. You know that you won't have that many competitors. And here you may have more chance to actually be invited for the written exams and to be for the CBI. And even if you don't have the position, you might be what we call rostered. So it means that you have been labeled as qualified for future job openings. And notably when the UN are in some kind in a rush, they might decide to hire people not having the full process with an exam, CBI. They might say, oh, we're going to pick people from the roster. So if you've been applying for this position in Juba and that it is clearly written in your file that you've been qualified as a P4, as a lawyer, it might be actually very good for you applying to Nairobi, to Vienna, to New York, to Geneva, so they would directly take you. So the roster is really something that you must have in mind among the few tips that you could get in. Yeah.
Thank you so much, both. And I think we have time for one more question. Now that we've covered tips that we might have for those who are further down in their career paths, we have a question from Carmen, who's a little bit earlier in her career, and that is, what would you advise someone who is going through their undergraduate degree but has a lot of work experience in NGOs? What advice would you have given yourself during your undergraduate degree if you were trying to go down your current career path?
That's a good question. But in any case, I'd say that definitely having NGOs experience is key. I mean, the UN are nothing without civil society, especially when it comes to human rights. And if I had to give me an advice going back to the beginning of my career, what would I say? I don't know, maybe especially if I go back really to this moment when I was studying, it would be like giving more, being more attentive to the classes I would have selected in my master programs, and also at an early stage, identifying what I really liked and maybe having internship related to really the position I wanted to get in the future or the areas. It's something that I kind of neglected at some point. I was all into the PhD, and so I would say do not ever, ever underestimate, undermine the work of civil society. Really, it's crucial. It's because I was with civil society that I'm sure that I've been selected for the United Nations. I'm French, so I mean, French people in the UN, we are so many people. So what makes difference for me, I'm sure it was language skills, but also having the experience from civil society.
Yeah, I'll second that. I think a lot of the colleagues that I work with within the United Nations system actually come from civil society, and they leave the UN, join civil society, and then rejoin the United Nations system. So there's a lot of back and forth between the United Nations and civil society organizations. In a lot of ways, they are interconnected and work together, also in the field. Now, in terms of the advice, I'd say two things. One is try. If you don't try, you won't get it. If you don't attempt, you won't get it. So try, attempt. That's number one. The other thing is don't be too rigid on your own career plans that you might have decided for yourself, because accidents happen. Good accidents happen, and it may take you in a direction which you had never even thought would be wise for you. I can give you my own personal experience. I come from a family of lawyers, successful lawyers, big lawyers in India. In my mind, growing up, it was always a given that I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to join the family law firm, practice in law. I did practice in the Supreme Court of India for 7 years. I had tremendous success. I had 5 judgments that were reported by the Supreme Court of India for public importance, which is a very rare thing at least in the initial years of your career. And then, just by strange twist of fate, the Supreme Court nominated me to go to Tokyo at our sister organization, which is called the United Nations University, on a 3 months project, because they were researching on international trade law and human security. And so because I was working on international trade law a bit. I went there for 3 months. Those 3 months went into 6 months. And then I discovered or rediscovered academia. And I just, was in a fix about whether I want to go back to legal practice or do I want to continue in academic research. So those 6 months ended up 1 year. And then, and it's a long story, but I ended up in Costa Rica at the University for Peace 16 years ago. And I've never left since then. So the whole idea that, my whole field was